Stop the national suicide. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. John, we're back.
Hello, Martin. How you going?
Very good. Long time no see.
Yes, it has been 10 months since we've done the last show. It's been a lot of people have been asking questions. Where have I been? I have been on an interesting quest, perhaps one of the longest quests of my life. One of perhaps the most challenging things I've had to do. Can't say too much for now because a lot of people want to know what exactly have I been doing. But in due course, all will be revealed. But I'm great to be back here with you, talking, consistent with our ethos and brand in the interest of the people. And there's definitely a lot of things for us to, there's a lot of things for us to have a chat about because a lot has happened in the last 10 months.
Absolutely. Well, it's a fair old time. I lost my wife. You've been chasing your tail for a long, long time. But of course, the world moves on. The politicians continue to dig holes for themselves and everybody else. And frankly, the economic dial is sort of critical at the moment, it seems to me. And not many people really seem to know what's going on.
No. So I thought about what should our first show be back after 10 months. And obviously, we're in the midst of an election campaign, but we are really headed towards the abyss. So the title of the show is Stop the National Suicide. I mean, I think I've said it in previous years when I've been recording. By every statistical measure, this country has been in decline for more than 20 years. So when we look at, for example, your financial data, mortgage stress, rental stress, financial stress in general, people's economic conditions are not getting better despite what the official statistics say, and no doubt we'll have plenty to say about that over the next few weeks as we unpack the economic data. But when we look at things like public health, when we look at people as sort of, whether they're fit or obese, mental health, when we look at educational outcomes, things around narcotics use, all sorts of public metrics show that we are not performing in terms of a strong, robust societal culture. And the question is, well, why? So I think there's a big portion of the people themselves have somewhat to blame for the circumstances in which we now find ourselves in. But also, I think we have been extremely led down the wrong path by elites across a whole set of institutions, whether it's Parliament, the bureaucracy, the press, the financial institutions, a whole host of social organisations as well, has led us towards a path where a lot of Australians don't feel confident about their own lives. They're not happy. They don't feel secure. They're not optimistic. And even I think it was last week or the week before, there was an article I read where up to 40% of Australians don't feel like they would want to fight for their own country if we were invaded by a foreign power. So even confidence or belief in our own country has collapsed as well. So there's definitely a lot to be concerned about, and we've been raising the alarms for a number of years around a whole host of topics, and there'll be more topics to raise as we go forward into 2022. But I think that what I really want to communicate to the audience is that we have what I call the big, the four-party quartet. So Liberal, National, Greens, and Labor. They have effectively had political power for 20 years. I mean, if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, the Democrats had the balance of power in the Australian Senate, and then they collapsed once they supported John Howard's GST package. And that was Meg Lees, who was the leader then. So that basically went away, and the Greens took over that sort of centre-left minority vote. But since then, for 20 years, you've had these four parties who have basically, at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, have taken Australia in a particular direction. And that direction has led to, in my view, disastrous outcomes. And that's why at this coming election, I will be putting the four-party quartet at the bottom of the ballot in both the House of Reps and the Senate. And I think it's time that we focus on some of these minor parties, and there's and there is a range of choice in that for voters to pick from. But I think what we need is to sweep the establishment out of political power, and the establishment is not just the incumbent government; it's the whole architecture. These four parties, they need to go. We need new blood in with new Australians who don't come from a corrupt political system, and that we can actually have genuine people engaging in genuine policy debate, and hopefully we can start to correct some of the problems that this country has.
No, it is very concerning, isn't it? And I guess there's a broader context here. There are other places around the world where similar decaying of the political system and processes are actually also running. So in a way, we're not unique. But on the other hand, we do seem to be right in the eye of the storm at the moment. And of course, the election, which is raging at the moment, is showing that there really isn't a whole lot of new ideas from either side of politics at the moment. And it's sort of the same old, and a lot of spinning of wheels. But of course, our productivity continues to degrade. The amount of debt in the system continues to rise. And essentially, if you put it all together and think about it in a more future-orientated way, the question that I keep asking is, are we laying a foundation for a more successful and better future? And my view is, at the moment, no, we're not. We're just going round in circles or going backwards.
Yes, so I definitely agree that we're not laying a foundation for a solid future. But the other key point to note is that in terms of, is there a choice? And the reality is that with these four parties, there is no choice. There is a four-party consensus on the big topics. So when we talk about household debt, public sector debt, things like stagflation, which we talked about in 2020, the RBA is the kingpin of this entire monetary policy fiasco. No one's going to challenge their independence. Monetary policy is basically still the same. When it comes to fiscal policy, the Morrison government has handed down their budget for 4 projected years of deficits, public sector debt raging out of control at the federal level, and then you start to look at the state level. The only government that looks semi-reasonable is Western Australia, and that's because of the mining booms. They've been able to use those royalties to have a balanced budget. But other than that, state, local, federal government, complete mismanagement. And then I have to say, I worked for the coalition back in 2012, 2013, and this was all about, in some ways, of resurrecting the Howard legacy that I thought was fairly good, particularly around fiscal policy, industrial relations, strong economic management. Even though, to be honest, back in the 2000s, I was somewhat naive about the financial system and how that aspect of the market really works. And there is a lot that Howard is accountable for that I probably didn't know at the time that I know now. But there were still some good things that the Howard government did. But yet, you look at, for example, Rod Gillard was a complete mess, complete mismanagement in terms of the GFC. In terms of the response, all they did was just expand public sector debt, and they just allowed the banks to blow the bubble even higher. Even though we had a couple of years of going slightly sideways. And then you look at the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments. It is a continuation of the same. But I have to say, the last 2 years has been atrocious beyond Abbott and Turnbull. You look at the scandals inside of Parliament, alleged rape in terms of the Higgins case. The thing is that, you've got, a whole bunch of backstabbing. You have this situation where you've got a woman called Rochelle Miller, who on the public record has now received a $500,000 agreement because of alleged bullying in the workplace. Well, I worked in Parliament. I had people shout at me. To be honest, it's a very stressful environment. A politician can come in to work one day, and by the end of the day, their entire parliamentary political career could be over. Depending on what happens in that day, their ability to generate income for the rest of their life and for their family could be destroyed, depending if there is a scandal of monumental proportion. So it is a very stressful environment, it requires long hours, it requires dedication, but you do the job. I did the job because I love my country, so that's why I did it. And again, in this case, in relation to in terms of this woman who I used to work with. I mean, so I have come across her in a historical context, but she engages in according to the public record, a consensual relationship with the minister. She apparently doesn't get the promotion that she wants. She then gets moved to another minister's office, and then she apparently has some rough treatment there, and that results in a $500,000 payout. And yet we're just spending money willy-nilly, like you wouldn't believe. And I just can't believe that someone who engages in that sort of conduct on a consensual basis, if it was unwarranted or unwelcome, I mean, that's a whole different category of issue, because then it gets into criminal misconduct. But when it's consensual, and then there are repercussions because of your relationship with a particular minister of the Crown, it's like, well, I mean, to be honest, that's the terrain that you've dealt yourself with, and to be awarded $500,000 is just, I mean, I can't believe that, that sort of a negotiated payment was made, and that payment really is just hush money. It's just the government wants an issue to go away as we get close to the election, so they say, okay, we'll give you a generous payout, $500,000 plus cost. So the total is is potentially in terms of up to $1 million, and then you obviously have a whole host of people now coming out against Morrison, saying he's a liar, he's unethical, you can't trust him. And then you have, obviously, in terms of other scandals right across the parliament. So and beyond all of that, just in terms of the ethics and the character of the parliamentarians, because I think representation in politics has waned, because you don't have people from the real world going in. You've got political hacks that all they know from university have gone into political staff offices, through to pre-selections, through to politics. Being parliamentarians, and they have no commercial experience. They have no real world experience. They don't know what a real person goes through, because these politicians are being paid obscene amounts of money, kind of like how France was before the French Revolution. The aristocrats were being paid. They had exorbitant sums of wealth, and then the people of Paris couldn't afford bread. I mean, we're getting into that sort of level of society. So, but beyond that, I mean, and we have to be very sensitive because we are broadcasting on YouTube. COVID-19 management has been a complete unmitigated disaster, both in terms of the economic response, which we spoke about last year and in 2020, but also in terms of, did we use the best public health and science to deal with the pandemic? I mean, there's all sorts of studies coming out across the world saying that the measures used in places like Australia and the United Kingdom and America were very poorly thought through. They were not effective in actually mitigating in terms of public health risk, and it was a disproportionate response. And the harm that it created in terms of political and civil rights, in terms of mental health, in terms of economic hardship, it was perhaps, in my view, the worst public administration disaster since 1915. And why 1915? Because that's when we landed in Gallipoli, and we basically, and Australia lost, I think tens of thousands of soldiers in perhaps one of the worst military disasters in Australian and British history.
So, it's interesting when you said it in this bit of context, because we're almost wherever you look, there's policy failure, there's activity which is dodgy, to put it politely. And we also, of course, know that big business has been very, very, very focused on supporting their own interests. And if you look carefully, there's been a lot of money gone into the oil industry and into the resources sector from government. And we also know, of course, that there were a number of rorts, the car parks rorts and the other stuff that's gone on. Pretty much wherever you look, there's public money gone out the door on a very, very dodgy basis.
Yes, not only about the public money, but also you think about the agenda of the coalition. And so, you've spoken over the years with coalition backbenchers. I continue to speak with people on the backbench. And there is a real big difference between the backbenchers and then once you get into some of these cabinet ministers who have deep links into both big business, but also big bureaucracy, and then some of these international forums like the World Economic Forum, which Morrison recently spoke at, and then a whole host of these in terms of other international bodies. I mean, you and I spent 16 months fighting the cash ban, and we were successful in achieving that. But that policy should never have even been on the table. I mean, think about what was being contemplated: 2 years jail for using legal tender. I mean, it was just a ridiculous proposition that had no empirical basis for it. And yet we had to waste 16 months of our lives just to stop ourselves from going to jail. I mean, you start to think to yourself, okay, this government has been pushing a range of policy ideas. Where are they getting their ideas from? That they're clearly not getting it from, common sense policy advocates. I mean, they are getting them from really dangerous people, and some of those dangerous people are domestic. Some of them are in think tanks in academia, but also they are from overseas institutions, including the World Economic Forum. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of transparency about some of these relationships, where some of these ideas come from, and whether there are any sort of confidential deals that are done between governments and foreign entities about the implementation of some of the in terms of some of these ideas. So all of this is very dangerous, and this is why I think that the current power elite need to be removed so that we can get a new crop of people who don't have these sort of international linkages, and hopefully we can get some common sense thinking back into the halls of power, and we can start actually to address, what are the key issues that are plaguing Australia. Because when I look at the campaign that's had, because we're 4.5 weeks until election day, and I should say, as we speak tonight, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition are having their only debate on Sky News live, and for them not to have a debate on Sunday night on free to air and for the whole nation to see, I think that whole situation is just a complete outrage. But again, what real solutions are they providing to fix a lot of these things? I mean, they're providing Mickey Mouse solutions, and they're not going to get to the heart of the issues. I mean, even for example, in terms of mortgage stress and rental stress, I mean, all they're saying is we need to build more houses. Well, it's not about building more houses. I mean, because if you build more houses, what do the banks do? They lend more, they make more profit. So it's actually, we have an issue in the financial system. It's not an issue of land supply and zoning, and in terms of a lack of real estate. It's something else, and no one wants to confront that we have this huge bubble. So again, we are just headed in completely in the wrong direction. And we need to do, when I say we, you and I and the community at large need to do something if we're going to try to take this country back and actually put it back on the right path. And just before we sort of move on, one point I will say is that some of our viewers would have heard recently that there was a scandal involving Scott Morrison and how he got into Parliament in terms of his pre-selection in the seat of Cook. And then people would have seen that there's a gentleman called Michael Toke who came out and gave a number of media interviews and basically said that he was rigged using a whole host of dirty tricks. Now, Michael Toke, I used to work with him. I used to work in one senator's office, and he was working for Senator Verivanti Wells, who we should actually put up in terms of this slide. She, in her valedictory speech, she lost her pre-selection a few weeks ago. She gave a speech on Budget 9, a quite extraordinary speech, where she blasted everyone, and she basically said that the Prime Minister is he's not fit to be the PM. So now a lot of people were sort of stunned as to, why haven't we heard this story before about how Morrison was using the race card and saying we can't have a Lebanese person being pre-selected in terms of the seat of Cook, and we never learnt about in terms of what happened. He lost the first ballot, I think 82 votes to 8, and then he became the candidate. Well, fun enough, you and I covered this in 2016. So we actually did one of our, I think it was our 5th episode, where I think at the time you were a little bit nervous about talking about this, but we talked about it because Sam Daciaro came out on public radio and basically said he was the one who put together in terms of the fake dossier that took Michael Toke out. I mean, isn't this remarkable that if you look at, say, Trump, the Trump-Russia scandal was instigated by a fake dossier by a former MI6 agent called Michael Steele. and that was the catalyst for an entire fake investigation. Well, the Liberals basically, did use the same tactic before the Democrats in America. So this is not a left-right issue. The right used it in Australia, and the left used it in terms of in terms of America. And so they used basically a fake dossier of bogus allegations, linked it to the media. His reputation got destroyed. He lost the pre-selection, and then once that whole scenario was over, he sued the paper successfully for defamation, and he got a payout. So Morrison is an extremely dirty player, and so I think Verity Wells was correct to call this out when she did only a few weeks ago. But I should say, having known Verity Wells for 20 years, she doesn't come with clean hands either. So it's a very ugly and messy game. And to be honest, to become a politician through these major institutions like the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, you have to be dirty. You have to be Machiavellian. You have to be willing to stab anyone in the back if you are to be elevated to these positions in the context of, say, Frank Underwood in terms of the House of Cards. I mean, some of them don't have to go to those lengths. Some of them do go to those lengths, and I know some of them who have. So we need to basically say to these major parties, enough is enough, and we need a completely new set of people and a completely new direction.
And I guess it's very interesting to me, John, as to what extent the issues that we're talking about are driven by those behaviours and those learned routines that they go through, and to what extent it is actually more driven by the neoliberal philosophy of markets have got to win at any cost, et cetera, right? Because there seems to me to be an ideological lens. You've got to look at this as well as the behavioural lens, and maybe the two come together in some way, because I think some of the policies that have been pushed through over the last few years have been all centred around a very specific way of thinking about the way markets work, and the role of competition, and the role of big business, and the role of individuals, and how they basically are subservient to the rest. So there is an ideological aspect as well as, I think, the behavioural aspect.
Martin, so the one thing I'll say is that while some of it may be ideological, I think a lot of it is to do with mathematical necessity. So when we look at in terms of economic policy, they only have one choice, and it doesn't matter who's in power, and that is to keep on pumping up in terms of the amount of debt that is in the system to keep the bubble going. And that's not just a domestic consideration; that's also a global consideration as well, because we have central banks working in unison with prudential regulators to keep these. To keep the bond markets intact, to keep the credit flowing, and because if they don't do that, the whole house of cards will fall, and basically the politicians and the bureaucrats will be blamed, and they're trying to avoid that at all costs. So I think there is some ideology involved in some of these aspects, but particularly around economic policy, it is that they are so wedged into a corner that they don't have the courage to look people in the eye and saying we're screwed. We have to basically collapse the economy if we're going to have a good new foundation, and so all they can do is just continue to avoid talking about these issues directly, and just allow the banks and the RBA to run up huge amounts of household debt. At the same time, we're running up huge amounts of public sector debt.
Yeah, and it's interesting, if you think of what Phil Lowe's been doing over the last 6 months, every time he has an outing, he sort of capitulates slightly more towards rates have got to go up. Go back, it was 6 months ago, it was 2024, right? And then, now it's sort of closer and closer. And the last time around, he actually said, we'll probably come to this thing quite soon. In other words, they lost the patience line that was always in the minutes of the Reserve Bank until quite recently. But again, it's very much face saving, and it's very much positioning. There's no real fundamental logic in what's been going on. And that's what I find really frustrating, that at the end of the day, a lot of words, but no one's really thinking through the consequences of those decisions, in my view.
No, look, so I definitely would agree. No one's thinking through the consequences. No one's thinking long term, and there's no accountability in terms of the system. So when politicians and bureaucrats do stuff up, I mean, under the Westminster system, people are supposed to resign. Well, I mean, those days have long gone, and unfortunately, we are stuck with a whole host of incompetent people driving us into the abyss. Now, so we're going to get close to wrapping up the show, but a couple of points that I just want to touch on is that voters need to be wary that this four-party quartet are trying anything and everything they can to stay in power. So for example, there was a couple of polls earlier this week. I think it was there was a poll for the Sydney Morning Herald and Melbourne Age that said 21% of voters are still undecided, which kind of means that the election's up in the air. It could be, say, like 2004, where it could come down to the handshake, the infamous handshake between Mark Latham and John Howard, and 3 days before the election, that could turn the tide one way or the other. But also, I think Newspoll only 2 days ago said that up to 29% of voters are likely to vote for a minor party or an independent. So we are seeing some record numbers, and primary vote for the two major parties are at record low, but also in terms of trust and confidence. So they know they are in trouble with the electorate. A good chunk of the electorate don't want them. And obviously they want to try to retain power so that they can basically continue enjoying in terms of the spoils of office, but also to continue taking us down this particular path, which for whatever reason they're obsessed in taking us down. So, but one of the things that they are doing, but also the whole host of vested interests who are also trying to take us in down a particular direction, they're engaging in misleading, deceptive conduct. And you and I had a very interesting discussion before we started in the context that when it comes to the Corporations Act and financial products and money, misleading, deceptive conduct is both a civil and criminal offence. So you can, particularly around commercial matters, you cannot be dishonest, or you cannot mislead people to having one perception where the truth is completely different, because in those situations people can lose money, there's financial harm, and obviously when it comes to corporation and financial regulation, the whole purpose is to protect the interests of investors and consumers. So that's what we do in the realm of money and finance. But when it comes to politics, even though we do have some rules around how people can present themselves, there's still a lot of wiggle room that allows for deceptive and misleading, deceptive conduct. And so there's just a few small examples that I just want to highlight, so that if people are looking at, well, who do I choose in this election, they're not going to fall for a couple of traps. So the first one is, and so we have an article that was reported by the ABC. So what the two major parties are doing is that they're writing to constituents and saying, if you intend to vote for a postal vote, you have to put in a request form to the AEC. So how about we actually assist you in that process? So we're going to give you a form, you fill it out, and we will pass your details onto the Australian Electoral Commission, and the Australian Electoral Commission will get will post out your postal vote, and you get to vote who you want for. But in the process of doing this, well, what are these people actually doing if they complete the form? They're actually giving their personal details to the major parties, and this is a huge data harvesting exercise. So when you look at, for example, what happened in America in the last few electoral cycles in terms of big data, if you want to do analytics, if you want to psychologically manipulate the population, you need to have a rich database of who the voters are in which parts of the country and what are their key issues, so that you can start to target certain messages to certain people and manipulate certain parts of the country in one way or the other. So, for example, let me give you a good example, the issue of coal. So for example, Anthony Albanese was asked about coal yesterday, and he basically endorsed coal. Now, why did he do that? Because in Queensland and in Newcastle, coal is a very big issue, whereas in the inner city of Melbourne and Sydney, they're anti-coal. So basically, you've got one issue where in different parts of the country, that one issue will have a huge impact on how people will assess their policies and in terms of how they vote. So that's how they. So that's how, when you get big finance financing a political campaign, and how do you start to manipulate different parts of an electorate? You have to use micro-targeting, big data, social media, a whole host of techniques. But this is all based on having a rich data set of knowing who's who in the zoo, and then using your analytical social media techniques to actually then deploy that data in particular ways. So data harvesting is a big activity that the major parties are using to further their power empire. And obviously, a lot of voters are getting caught out, and they're not realizing that these, what seem to be very noble. In terms of a noble exercise, hey, we're going to save you the trouble of applying to the AEC. We will do it on your behalf, and you'll get your postal ballot. No, they're trying to take your data so they can use it against you to manipulate you through a whole host of forms of media.
Yes, and just to be clear, you can ask the AEC directly. Right?
Exactly.
You can go direct to the website, and you can fill out the form, and you don't need to go through any party or any third party. But that's not made clear by those other routes that you mentioned there. So it is a deceptive piece of activity, but as you say, it's to capture data.
Exactly. Now, one of the other sort of really deceptive things that's happening in this campaign is these so-called independents. So you have a whole bunch of independents primarily focus on blue ribbon Liberal seats. So the seats of, for example, Kooyong, which is Frydenberg, Goldstein, which is Tim Wilson, and then you've got North Sydney, McKellar, Bradfield, in terms of and Wentworth as well, in terms of some of these seats. So you have these independents who are supposedly part of the community. They're running because they want to see change in the country, but in reality, this is an orchestrated campaign by a central body. Now, there's a group called Climate 200, and they're getting, apparently, they have corporate money, they have community money, and they're basically financing all of these independents, and they're basically coordinating their campaigns. Now, how do I know that? Because I know one of the advisory members of their council who I spoke to, and he basically said, that these so-called independents are basically linked to us. Now, you would think to yourself, well, why wouldn't, if all of these independents, and there's about 10 to 12 of them around the country, why wouldn't they just run as a political party? Climate 200, if climate change is their big single issue item, just run as a party. Well, why are they running it as independents? Because they're trying to give the electorate a misleading and deceptive perception of who they are and what they intend to do if they get elected versus what the reality is. And so, again, if you want to vote for one of these independents, that's your democratic right to do so, but you must understand that these people are being financed by a central body, coordinated by a central body, Climate 200. Climate 200 has a public website, so you can read about them, and they have a whole bunch of extremely high-profile, current and former politicians who are part of that group, so you can actually learn about who they are, what they do, and why they're doing it. So, and again, if climate change is your big issue, then these independents may be the candidate for you. But if you think that these are people who are genuinely independent, that have no affiliation with any sort of centralized, coordinating body, because again, whether it's the Liberal Party, Labor Party, Greens, etc., all of these candidates are being dictated to by central HQ. Well, these independents, to a large degree, are also that, but a genuine independent is that they are independent of any form of coordination, and these candidates are not. So that is definitely one thing that candidates need, so that voters need to look out for. One thing just about our local electorate. So you and I, one of the funny things, Martin, as I've been talking to people over the last few months, people still haven't realised that you and I live in the Illawarra. So we live in the Wollongong area. So
God's country.
Yes. So actually, someone the other day said, the other week when they met me, they said, "I thought you two were based in Melbourne." I said, "No, we are based here in the Illawarra." So now we live, in terms of the federal electorate, we live both in the electorate of Cunningham. So you live in the northern part of the electorate, and I live in terms of the southern part. So now we have a candidate running for the Labor Party. There are signs all over the place, and the name on the sign is Alison Byrne. So I actually took a picture of this sign in my suburb. So why don't we actually put this up? So this is Alison Byrne, Labor for Cunningham. She's the endorsed Labor candidate. But only a few months ago, that was not her public name that's probably not even her legal name. She actually was going by another name, and her name prior was actually Alison Burns Scully. Now, why Scully? Because her husband is the state member for Wollongong, Paul Scully, who's also in terms of Labor. So what we are, and what I should also say is, Alison Burns Scully, which is her real name, is she was the former chief of staff for the former member, which was Sharon Bird. So we basically have what we're having here in our electorate is an attempt by one couple, husband and wife, to basically take over the Wollongong region and to solidify power in basically a political power couple. And so that is the reality of what is happening in the state of Cunningham. But and to be honest, I mean, if she is the wife of Paul Scully, why wouldn't she be proud of be actually having Scully on the banner? Because if you look at all of her social media, she has removed any reference to Scully. And why? Because she's trying to not let the public know in our community that she is the wife of an existing state member, and that this is a genuinely independent campaign, and this is not a power grab by a married couple here in Wollongong. So that is the reality. Now, pretty big accusation. So how do I know that her proper name is Alison Burns Scully? Well, why don't we put up a couple of images? Now, I found a couple of things on the internet. So Paul Scully MP, who's the state member for Wollongong, in 2017 wished his wife happy birthday to my wonderful wife, Alison Burns Scully. So Paul Scully back in 2017 referred to his wife as Alison Burns Scully. And then there was an article in the Illawarra Mercury in 2016, which also refers to Alison Burns Scully, which is Miss Bird's chief of staff. Now, I have to say this article from 2016 is quite fascinating, because what it actually revealed was that the Paul Scully hired the husband of the member for Cunningham. So Sharon Bird's husband was the chief of staff to Paul Scully, and Paul Scully's wife was the chief of staff to Sharon Bird. So basically you have two couples, basically both being the MP and the chief of staff. And now that Sharon Bird has retired from politics, her chief of staff is now being elevated, but they don't want to let the public know that basically that one couple now wants to take over the entire region. And to what I should say is that, and again, I've never met in terms of Alison Burns Scully, so I won't say anything about her, but her public history is she has been a staffer for a couple of decades. So when we think about the quality of representation, are we getting people with genuine real life experience, whether in the public sector, as in terms of doing serious public policy work, or in terms of the private sector, in terms of running a business or working in a big corporate. The public evidence and the record shows that there is limited experience in terms of someone of her age. And obviously what I'm trying to sort of suggest is that we need to move away from people who have just spent their entire life in politics and actually bring new thinking, a new approach, and they're also not beholden to the power brokers in terms of the major parties. So someone changing their name 3 months out from the election, pretending not to be the wife of the state member for Wollongong, quite an outrageous thing. And what I should say is that some of these tactics that we've just discussed, if these things were done in the corporate sector, in relation to a financial product. The section is 1041H of the Corporations Act. People will have a legitimate claim to go to ASIC and say this is misleading, deceptive conduct. And ASIC, in the realm of financial products, takes that type of conduct extremely seriously. And I would love for a new law to be brought in on the federal books that say if you engage in misleading and deceptive conduct in politics, it is either a criminal or civil offence, because this would clean up a lot of these tactics, and a lot of voters are clueless about what is really going on in terms of how politicians and candidates are marketing themselves, and what's their real identity, who are they really linked to, what's their real intention. A lot of that is not being transparently provided to the voter, and that's how voters take the wrong perception and vote based on the wrong premise, and that's how we get bad political and public policy outcomes.
And, the bottom line is this, John, isn't it? You can't take anything that any of the politicians say at face value. That you've got to really ask some very, very much deeper questions. And they almost go out of their way to lead you up the garden path. I mean, this is deliberate policy, deliberate strategy. This isn't just accident. This is actually a deliberate strategies that people are executing. And frankly, there are lots of half-truths and there are lots of fragmented opinions being shared, and yet a lot of voters will be just bamboozled by all of this. And so they'll end up effectively voting for something that they didn't realise they were voting for at the end of the day.
Precisely. One point I'll just make on this, Martin, is that some of my sources in Canberra tell me reliably that every morning the Prime Minister spends direct time with his media team. He doesn't talk to his policy team, but he'll talk to policy when he has to talk to policy, to his policy team. But he will spend, and he will not delegate to the media team. He will sit down with his entire media team and say, what is the message? How do we get that message out there? And he is very, when the tagline Scotty from marketing. So he is very focused on public perception and getting the right messages out there, whether they are truthful, whether they are accurate. He doesn't really care about that as long as he gets the right projection out there. That is all he's focused on, and that's how he actually allocates his time when he's in the Prime Minister's office. So one thing I will do is, just before we wrap up, is I have already declared on social media how I'm going to vote. So I'm happy to say here on in terms of this show. So now the number one voting issue for me is COVID-19 management. I mean, I just think it's been an absolute disaster, and that's why I'm putting the four major parties last. I mean, there's a whole host of other issues which I just think have been atrocious, but I think COVID-19 management the last 2 years has been woefully bad in how it's been executed. And so basically, when it comes to the seat of Cunningham and New South Wales, so I'm going to vote the United Australia Party in the seat of Cunningham in terms of that candidate. And then in terms of the Senate, I'll be voting Liberal Democrat. And so Liberal Democrat, it's the candidate is actually a friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time, so I can vouch that he's a good guy, a genuine guy. I won't give any unfair advertising and sort of name him, but that's how my intention is. So I like to be transparent with in terms of, some people think that I'm a stooge for one organisation or another. So I'm a member of no political party, but that's how I intend to vote. So obviously it's really up to the public as to how they vote on election day. But there you go.
Well, thank you for that, John. I won't share my thoughts at the moment, other than to say that none of the major parties will get my vote. But the permutation after that gets quite interesting, right? And I'm still working that through, and I'm watching very closely what people are saying and how people are positioning. Because I agree with you, there has to be an alternative path shaped to this election. And I actually have the view that minor parties have a role to play in that, a very important role. And the thing that I want to underscore is that some of the major parties are saying, well, we don't want a hung parliament. We want to rule in our own right. Actually, I think it would be good for them if they weren't actually able to form a government in their own right, and actually it was actually the minor parties that had a considerable influence and a considerable role in actually shaping the future direction of policy in Australia. Because the last 20 years has been a disaster, And as I look forward over the next 15 or 20 years, I see nothing there in terms of positivity, in terms of actually, laying foundations for the future, for the next generation and for Australia. And I'm very frustrated that Australia is not actually yielding the potential that it has as a great country. So that's what I'm looking for this election. I'm just not looking for tactical stuff. I'm not looking for the fact that most of the major parties are saying the same things wherever they are. They're on the same side of the fence, right? So I'm looking for that vision thing, because I think that's going to be important for me when I actually make my final decision.
Yeah. So the moral of the story is, people probably don't want to hear it, because the people want to be, particularly after the last 2 years, they want an uplifting and nice message. But we have to face the facts. We are in decline. We are heading towards the abyss. It's not just the pessimistic John Adams saying this. I mean, people can look up the statistics on all sorts of criteria, and they'll be able to verify it for themselves. And the unfortunate thing is that the big four parties will not change that direction. Some people will make it worse than others. But if you want a completely new direction for Australia, you have to, you and I and the entire public have to basically, vote for something completely new and stop the national suicide that's happening at the moment.
Yep. John, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today. Great to be back in the studio with you, and I'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks. Martin North, John Adams, Interest to People. We'll see you next time.